everyone, and welcome to episode 35 of the History Hotline. My name is Deanna Lynn Cook, your host as always, and I have a special guest in the building. Today, we will be looking at African and Caribbean solidarity in Britain and on a global scale. And I am joined by the fantastic and wonderful Seun Matiluko, who is a journalist, writer, and researcher in law, politics, race, and history. Her brain, I don't know how it all fits because she is a fantastic in all the things she's written and studied. And she's currently studying law, although recently did a master's at LSE, where her dissertation focused on Black women in Britain and how they tied their support for decolonisation in Africa and the Caribbean to fight for civil rights in the UK. So she's got all that legal knowledge. We've got this history. We've got decolonisation, activism, Black women, Britain, Africa, Caribbean. There isn't a more perfect guest for this episode, let's be honest. So welcome, Seun, to the History Hotline.
Thank you for having me and thank you for your kind words.
No worries at all. Oh, it's my pleasure to have you here. So I think we should launch straight in because I know we've got so much planned to talk about today. But we're kind of coming from a place of, Black Britain. What does that mean? Who is included in that? What's the kind of issue with Black solidarity with Africans and Caribbeans? Who are we referring to when we speak about Africans and Caribbeans? Because there's dominant groups that are often kind of taking over the narrative. So we're going to be looking at all that kind of thing today. But let's get to know you a little bit better first. So, you've done a law degree. You are legally minded, shall we say. But then you've gone on to LSE to do, your historical study and your historical masters. So, why do you love history? Why is that something you're so kind of keen to study?
I guess I just wanted a deeper insight into who I am and who we are as a community, as a Black British community or communities. I think at school I really didn't learn anything about Black British people, and my parents come from Nigeria and I didn't really know too much about Nigeria. So I guess it's like the classic diaspora child of like not knowing where you belong. So I wanted to find out more about that.
Definitely. No, that makes sense. It is, I definitely think, the case for the diaspora when we're dropped off in these foreign lands, trying to kind of figure out where we fit and where we've come from and what that means for us. So yeah, makes sense. And your favourite historical time period or periods across any country?
I think I like the 1960s the most because I think that was an era of great hope, I think, for Black communities globally, thinking about civil rights in the United States, decolonization in Africa and the Caribbean, and even civil rights in the UK with like the Race Relations Acts. I think
Definitely.
The 1960s must have seemed like a really utopian time to be living in.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really interesting as well. And maybe because you've come from a different perspective into history, I feel like your thoughts are quite broad in a really nice way across the kind of global Black struggle for Black liberation. Whereas I think when we do history through like undergrad, we're taught to be quite narrow in our focus. You look at a specific time in Britain or a specific city, maybe, or a place. But I really like that your mind is kind of casted out so widely, and we're now able to look at the kind of intricacies of like the global struggle for Black liberation, which I think some of the kind of greatest historians like Walter Rodney, who we will speak about later, is just does so brilliantly. So I love that. I'm so excited. And your current research interests, kind of things you do, what are they?
I'm really interested in researching more about colonization and decolonization in Africa and the Caribbean, and also it's similar to what I did at LSE, really, also uncovering more histories of people in Britain who contributed to those struggles as well. Because I think just all of that history, I think, is not that well known about. And so I hope to write more about it and help promote that history more.
Definitely. Absolutely. I love that. So today, as we said, we're talking about Afro-Caribbean, African and Caribbean solidarity. We've got a lot of touch points and we're going to be jumping chronologically through time very quickly. So please forgive us. We will try and touch base with dates as frequently as possible just to make sure that you're sticking with it. But we just wanted to take an overarching view of solidarity kind of in this country to start with, between Africa and the Caribbean. Now, just for historical context, Africa is obviously the continent from which Black people are birthed, and I use black there in the term of having a certain amount of melanin and being, of that people. And through the transatlantic slave trade, from West Africa, for the most part, enslaved people were taken to the Caribbean and then mixed with the native people there, the Arawaks, the Tainos, the Amerindian peoples, and also the European colonizers that were there from the Dutch regions, whether that was, France, England, all the different colonizers in the Caribbean. So you've got this kind of mix of different cultures and peoples in the Caribbean that forms, yes, Black people, who were once African, who are now disconnected from that African culture, who have taken bits of language, who've taken bits of food and tradition and religion, but are unfortunately now separate in terms of culture. So we are kind of talking about one and the same people if we're looking at maybe base genetics, but culturally, which I would say is a kind of main reason for the way we are, how we're raised, and maybe our culture and our families, we are essentially different. And so then we fast forward to the Windrush generation per se, and this is a big fast forward because we've just gone from transatlantic slavery to the Windrush generation, but we start to see movement of Caribbean people in bigger numbers, and then later on people from Africa. If you listen to the 2 episodes ago, we did Nigerian migration into Britain on this podcast, and I had another guest. So if you want to hear more about that, you can listen to that. And past episodes, you've looked at the Windrush generation, but now you have a kind of Britain as another melting pot of people from the Caribbean who are a mixture of all the people I mentioned before and people from Africa and West Africa mainly, but not to exclude other parts of Africa as well as a continent, who are now all mixed in Britain and struggling for racial equality in different and the same ways, who come with different political identities, and I want to stress that, different religions, different, beliefs about how they should live or how they would like to live in this country. And so that's kind of where we begin. And something we discussed earlier is the fact that with things like the Sewell report, it seems as if we're being pitted against each other. Like that report suggested that if Black African students could do so well in a British classroom, why then could Black Caribbean boys not do as well? This idea of, well, what's gone wrong for you, Caribbeans? Why have people from West Africa managed to do so well here, per se? Disregarding class and all of the factors. But we feel like this conversation needed to happen because we often look at why don't Jamaicans and Nigerians like each other? But we're here to look at solidarity today. Sorry, I feel like I've spoken for about 15 years.
Right, even on that report, it was actually
Yeah,
interesting what they said about Black Africans versus Black Caribbeans, because I think we, for some reason, in our political discourse in the UK, we think that Caribbean people are all the same and African people are all the same, even though there are so many different countries. And
absolutely.
even within that, like African groups, I think it's the Institute for Race Relations a while ago, they did a study showing that there's actually different levels of attainment depending on which part of Africa people come from. So
Yeah,
you can't just say, "Oh, all Africans are doing well at school," because actually that's actually not the case. Um,
exactly.
so it's a blind discussion. They're blind leading the blind.
Well, yeah, so why we're here today to discuss all these things. I thought we'd start with Marcus Garvey,
Okay.
if that's okay with you, and Amy Ashwood Garvey, if we want to go there as well. I think it's probably one of the earlier movements and earliest of Pan Africanism and Black solidarity. Marcus Garvey is a Black nationalist, and he sets up an organization called the United Negro.
Improvement Association.
In- Thank you. There we go, the UNIA in 1914 to essentially bring people, quote unquote, back to Africa. And by people, I mean Black people that are in America being persecuted by, racism there, and in the Caribbean, because the Caribbean
Mm.
then would have been ruled by European governments, not, Black people necessarily, or people that really cared too much about the liberation of Black people. And so, yeah, he created this movement, and we see this kind of solidarity, or we see an attempt at solidarity between Africa and the Caribbean and African Americans who would have been in America at the time.
It was an interesting movement in a way because so some people, well, I think a lot of people have critiqued Marcus Garvey, but
Yeah,
his perspective, some people felt sort of erased the indigenous cultures of people in the Caribbean and in America and all different parts of the world. This idea that everyone somehow can unite under one soul. Back in the days, the time would have been Negro
yeah,
identity, and even this idea that native Africans, people on the African continent, are not yet civilized. But Marcus Garvey could come and become, I think, the emperor of Africa, and then
mm,
rule over, sort of having an empire that could rival the British Empire, which is
yeah,
interesting because it was sort of a decolonial mindset, but with empire still at the forefront, if that makes sense.
yeah. It's like his imagination stretched as far as black liberation, but not as far as actually overthrowing the whole system. Yeah, and it was a case that Marcus Garvey's his ships never sailed. The Black Star Line
Yeah.
didn't ever go back to Africa. And I think Marcus Garvey, he was Jamaican, just for context, so started out in the Caribbean, and I think he was probably most popular and most well followed and recognized in the United States. And I think it might suggest a situation in the United States at that time needing some kind of movement back to Africa because, Black people had only found themselves in America due to transatlantic slavery. Whereas I think in the Caribbean, whilst his movement was still prominent and he's a national hero there now in Jamaica and he's on the money, literally, I think the movement might have had less significance there than it did in America, where people were crying out for some kind of answer to the quote unquote Negro problem, as it was known at the time.
Even on that, it's interesting that you say that Marcus Garvey's on the money, because I think I need to fact check this, but it's either
Yeah.
just during independence or now to this day they had a
Yeah.
black star, I think, on a Ghanaian coin, and
Oh,
even like
wow.
the flag of Ghana is um reminiscent of the Pan African flag. But back to America though, I think it's interesting how people in America viewed him differently. So famously, he had a feud with W.B. Du Bois, because and many people have many different ideas about what the root of the struggle was, but essentially, Marcus Garvey felt that within Black nationalist politics, dark skin or quote unquote fully black people should be at the forefront as opposed to mixed people. And W.B. Du Bois came from a mixed background. And so, like, just to put into context, so in many parts of the Caribbean and I think in Jamaica as well, light skinned people tended to be at the upper milieu of society
Absolutely.
as opposed to dark skinned people. And one could make similar claims about the United States. But
Hmm.
W.B. Du Bois felt that Marcus Garvey was trying to inject this sort of intra-racial discord where there didn't need to be one. W.B. Du Bois felt that mixed race black people and non-mixed race black people were united in the United States, and that Marcus Garvey was coming to try and uh, shake things up. I think at one point W.B. Du Bois called Marcus Garvey a traitor, and he might, and like I think even like an idiot or an incompetent person or something like that. It got quite heated at times.
Yeah.
Their beef.
But definitely the idea that there were different arguments and different ways that Black people were trying to liberate themselves and each other. And W.E. Du Bois, he is just kind of one of those examples in America. You've got people like, oh, his name's not coming to me, but it will at some point, who argued a kind of different way of liberating Black people. I think that is the same thing as Britain today, in a sense of people sometimes ask the questions, well, why there's so many West Africans in the Conservative Party, when the Conservatives have a history of kind of racial comments and racism. But if that is the political leanings of your country that you've come from before migration into Britain are going to have an impact on then how you want to liberate yourself potentially and practice your politics when you come to this country.
I also think it's important to recognize as well, because I think so because of social media, I think people are more aware of black people when they call certain black people on the political right, like coons or Uncle Toms and what have you. And people act like it's modern phenomenon, this idea that black people like are throwing barbs at each other, like it's just because of, I don't know, wokeism or whatever the new word is. But
Yeah,
realistically, if you go back, even back to W.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey or Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., these were all
of
people who
course.
had very, very harsh words to say against one
Yeah.
another. Black people often, because we are a people who, for a long period of time, were oppressed due
Hmm.
to our race. We all have different views about how to attain full liberation. And I think that's where these sort of beefs or arguments come from. And I think it'll be better sometimes for our political discourse for us to recognize that rather than
Yeah.
pretend that, oh, black people are just insulting other black people on Twitter because, I don't know, the political left told them to or something. Like it's a wider conversation than that.
Yeah, definitely. And I just remembered it was Booker T. Washington that W.E.B.
Uh,
Du Bois used to argue with a lot in terms of that movement. And as you have correctly said, it's not just a new social media phenomenon that we argue with other people about, their political beliefs, especially in regards to being black. It's something that has happened. And I think sometimes when you read back the debates, because they weren't arguing over social media, they were penning essays and writing
yeah.
speeches and arguing in halls. Those, like, some of the lines, you're like, oh,
Like
okay.
even Marcus Garvey's newspaper, Negro World, I
Yeah.
can't remember what year exactly it was. I think it might be 1924. They had the first page of Negro World saying W.B. Du Bois is a race traitor. Like, can you
Exactly.
imagine?
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's crazy. And I think it was even, I was thinking, I think we're going to speak maybe a little bit about Ethiopia and Rastafarianism, which kind of came out of Jamaica. But Marcus Garvey criticized Haile Selassie and
Yeah,
said that he was a coward and a traitor because in his land, black men were being whipped and enslaved. So even then, as the movement of like Rastafarianism grows, and people are turning to Ethiopia and Haile Selassie, you've got Marcus Garvey coming in with the criticism. I think Marcus Garvey seems to have quite a cantankerous personality as a
yeah,
historical
cantankerous,
figure.
especially because he marries two women named Amy, and so his first wife, but his second wife was his first wife's maid of honor. Like how more cantankerous can you get than that? Imagine you're walking down the aisle, this woman is throwing flowers and saying, "Oh my gosh," like crying at your wedding, saying, "Oh my gosh, I'm so happy for your love." Next year, she's married to your man. Can you imagine? Like nothing in the
Wow.
Real Housewives has ever shown anything like that.
Honestly, this is why history is fascinating to me. They don't teach you this at school and they really should. Oh,
Honestly,
no.
I
Yeah.
actually would love to see like a reality TV show reenactment of some events in history, like
Yes.
people like turn to the camera like, I can't believe she did that. I called her a broke Negro. She should know better.
Honestly, definitely. And even like as you brought up earlier, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, those
Yeah,
clashes were fierce as well. And looking back at it as a black person in 2021, you kind of look back and think, well, nobody was necessarily wrong. They just saw the future of black people in a different way. And I think
exactly.
that I kind of find it fascinating actually that they can kind of envision such a different world, but also them all being quite realistic in some ways, and so hopeful. So yeah, I think that's
And we
really
have that
important.
today. We have that today,
Exactly.
right? With the people, I guess the West African minded folks we were talking about earlier in the Conservative Party who believe
Yeah.
that if we, well, I don't want to speak for all of them, but it seems the prominent ones seem to believe that if we stop talking about race and racism, perhaps it'll go away. That's
Mm,
one perspective. We might critique that perspective. And then
yeah.
there are other people like Black Lives Matter who believe that if we defund the police, if
Mm,
we think about the hostile environment, if we teach more about colonial histories,
yeah, of course.
uh, if we get rid of things like no fees, no funds, which is another immigration
Mm,
policy, we can create a better future for Black people. So we still see this throughout centuries. Even we could go back to like the Haitian Revolution, right? There are people within the
yeah,
Haitian Revolution who had different views about black
it's true.
what the future would mean for Black people. And so
Yeah,
I think that's why history is really important because you get to understand that we've played this level before, kind of like in a
yeah,
video game. We've done this before,
I get you.
and it's important to catch that.
No, I like that. I like that a lot. We've been here before. in so
Yeah.
many ways. And a lot of people kind of look at that kind of comment of we've been here before as we've fought these racist fights before, we've fought these battles before, we've been to these protests before. But I think also we've had these, as you said, conversations with each other as Black people before as well. Yeah, very interesting. Right, I think we should move to Britain in a
Okay.
more micro level. Um, and we can start with activism and organizations such as maybe the Black Panthers. And I put the Black Panthers on the list. Me and Shane, we kind of created a list together, by the way, just for you listeners. So I had the Black Panthers on there because Shane originally said Olive Morris, who we're going to talk about in a second. And the Black Olive Morris was one of the members of the Black Panther movement. It wasn't a party in Britain. There's an episode on that if you want to know more depth. And I will be plugging episodes throughout this because we're referencing a lot of things that we've already talked about. And so within the Black Panther movement, I found it very interesting because even though it was established in 1969, which we would have seen, majority of Caribbean migrants settle in, and that Windrush generation and their families by that point coming over, that's where we start seeing some of the activism in education because their children are now in schools, their wives have come over to join them. Because I think 1963 we see the Commonwealth Immigration Act, which restricts the movement of people. So a lot of people kind of came into the country before that law was passed. And so surprising for me was the kind of the mix of people from West Africa and also people from the Caribbean that made up the Black Panther movement. So we have for I was gonna say for the Caribbean side, we've got people like Darkest House comes from Trinidad. We've got Linton Kwesi Johnson, Neil Kenlock, the photographer, Althea Jones Acoint from Trinidad as well, I believe. And then we've also got
Yep.
Asian people too, which is just adding a whole other dimension. But I will
Whole
mention
different
Farouk
conversation.
Gandhi and Marla Sen, absolutely. And then from West Africa, we've got people like Obi Akbuna. We've got David Udo, who I was trying to find information about. And I honestly was coming up to brick wall after brick wall. And I just wished I'd been able to get to the library to potentially do some more research on him because I was stumped at so many different levels. But yeah, you've got these people that have started the Black Panther movement, seeing a need for liberation in the 60s and following this idea of Black power that we've kind of imported in from America and the Black Panthers there. And I just thought it was interesting that it wasn't like some of the movements that would have Caribbean in the name or African in the name, like the African Student Union of a bit earlier, or like the Caribbean Workers Association. It was specifically just the kind of Black Panthers, and I feel like that pulls then more from America's Black Power as opposed to necessarily liberation movements in Africa or the Caribbean more specifically.
That is interesting, actually. Like thinking about names, right? Because you
Yeah,
have the League of Colored People, I
yeah,
think, back in, I'm going to get the date wrong, I think
20s,
maybe
20s,
the
I think.
20s, the 20s,
Yeah,
yeah.
with Harold Moody.
So it's interesting, I guess, at different points of history, there's this need to have sort of pan-Africanist or united organizations, and then also need to
Yeah,
have separate organizations as well. Because I think we still do see this to some extent today. We do have movements like Black Lives Matter,
true.
or even stuff like Sister Space,
Yeah,
or even the Black. Is it that there's a institute for women who suffer from domestic violence set up by Asian women, Southall Black
oh,
Sisters.
Southall Black
So
Sisters, yeah.
yeah, this idea. So that, but then also at the same time, we have various different Nigerian forums, Jamaican forums,
Of course.
Trinidadian forums in the UK, Ghanaian
Yeah,
forums. So I guess we have, again, maybe we're playing the same video game level. We see these organizations which are united and then separate, and perhaps there's space for both. Perhaps there is space for both. Um,
definitely.
but with the British Black Panther movement, what you say is really, really interesting, right? Because Obi Egbuna becomes the first leader, I believe,
Yeah, he does.
of the British Black Panther movement, before he gets, I think, arrested. Um,
Yes.
and I think that's really interesting because, as you say, a lot of the Caribbean population in Britain had settled or were more settled, I guess, than the West African population in Britain. So it's interesting
Yeah,
that upon arriving fairly recently in Britain, Obiaguna felt the need to um, be at the forefront of this movement,
Yeah,
which
definitely.
I'm not sure perhaps what that tells us. We could say maybe that Nigeria just ended its civil, well, was in throes of civil war at the time. So
Mm.
maybe he had a radical perspective coming from Nigeria.
I think
Because
he did. He had a Marxist leaning, and he kind of was, his ideas were linked in and kind of thinking about the importance of like international struggle against capitalism, which fits
yeah,
more into like Walter Rodney and that kind of idea. Um, yeah, he capitalist oppression was his thing, and I think, well, obviously the Black Panthers are quite a Marxist and left leaning movement, and if it's following on from America, then obviously that's going to continue in Britain. Maybe his political leanings in that Marxist tradition really does just kind of not discredit or remove any like nationalist ideologies, but the fact that Marxist was kind of his strongest identifying factor, because I find that I keep saying about Walter Rodney, I am actually obsessed with him, but he was a similar, 'cause he moved between the Caribbean, different countries in Africa, and he was quite involved with Marxism and didn't necessarily focus on his specific home country of Guyana or Jamaica, where he went to university, or
mm,
London. So maybe it was this political kind of leaning that was taking precedence over nationality or race.
yeah, I think so. And even taking precedent over race again is an interesting conversation because with a
Yeah,
lot of these movements in sort of the late 60s, 70s, 80s, for better or for worse, we start talking about political blackness
yeah,
because this movement, although it's interesting, I think from all the photos I've seen predominantly black people, and then I think Farouk Dondi in the photos,
yeah.
but through their sort of through the documents that we have of the British Black Panther movement, it was basically anyone who was non-white
Mhm.
could define as part of their movement,
Yeah,
which is interesting.
definitely.
Which is
Yeah,
interesting because we seem to have moved away from that quite a
we
lot in
definitely have.
the present day. Even there was a whole maybe it's not good to keep bringing it back to Twitter, but I remember when we didn't quite know how Black Lives Matter in the UK was set up after they got all
Yeah,
their funding,
of
all their
course.
donations, and then there were a lot of people on Twitter saying, "Oh, it's politically black,"
Mm,
and we have all this we we have a very different perspective, I think, than older generations did about who
yeah,
can define as
definitely.
black, which is interesting.
Absolutely. I think as well, it kind of linked to who was being racially oppressed, and that was everyone that was not white. And so for Asians, they quite seamlessly fit into that. Also, a big wave of Indian people came from Africa, from East Africa, from Kenya
Yeah.
during the kind of conflict that was happening there. And so I think it was when OAD formed, which is Organization of Women of African Descent, as it started, but then changed to African and Asian descent, because if you're saying it's a women from, of African descent, their argument was that, well, we have come from Africa. We've literally come off a plane from Africa. Even though we are Indian and Asian, we are still facing, the same kind of issues that you are in Britain. And also because OAD started with roots in liberation of African countries and they were doing exactly that work, they fit seamlessly into OAD. And then you could kind of argue as time went on, it was one of the reasons they broke up, because all of the kind of divisions and different needs of groups of people began to change. But I think in the first instance, it wasn't just Black people in Britain that were being racially targeted. And because Asian people were being racially targeted in a very similar way, it was easier and probably safer to fight under one umbrella, because I don't
Yeah.
know, safety in numbers, we were not here in big numbers at that point. So,
We're still not.
so no, absolutely. I think they all genuinely just felt they had to fight together, not to oversimplify any of their thoughts or reasons, but I think that kind of stemmed from that, to be fair.
Yeah, and it's interesting speaking to some older Asian people who still identify as black. I was speaking to the um, journalist Yasmin Alibi Brown the other
Yeah.
day, who we had like a cordial disagreement because I think she thinks that there still should be this understanding of all non-white people of being black. And I
Yeah,
guess that perhaps shows a different mentality amongst the generations because
definitely.
because I was saying that perhaps black people today for our generation means people primarily of African descent. But Yasmin was saying that, she's originally from Uganda. Is she not
Yeah.
of African descent? is saying that she's not of African descent. Is that a similar thing to
Yeah,
white people in England telling us that we don't really belong? We can never be British, that sort of thing.
yeah,
So I think it's
definitely.
interesting hearing from that perspective.
It is really interesting. And
Yeah, and it's
even with this podcast, actually, I've struggled sometimes to think like how far and how much maybe Asian history do I want to include? Yeah, how far do I want to include the histories of Asian people in Britain, and does that then detract from what we're trying to do with Black history? Yeah,
it's a
I've had these.
complicated.
It's
I think
really
it's a complicated
complicated.
story because I think what's important to remember about Black liberation struggles, and again I'll start from enslavement onwards, is like Black people have always had like a transnational support for one another. Whether we're thinking about the end of slavery, civil rights, decolonization, end of apartheid, Black people have always been supporting other Black people. Of
Yeah,
course, like you have Black people who don't support other Black people, but I'm talking that's generally Black people have always been supporting other Black people. But even within that, we have had in all those movements from enslavement, civil rights, decolonization, end of apartheid, we've had other groups involved and having solidarity with us as well.
yeah,
And that's the interesting thing about this conversation, I think, because for parts of our history, Black people in the Caribbean, Black people in Africa, and Black people in Britain, and even I think in the United States, have had solidarity with different groups of Asian people, and then at the
mm,
same time have had hostilities with different groups of Asian people. And so
yeah,
I guess it's working out our place in all of that, right?
definitely.
Because there are still people to this day who feel that, well, I guess there could be a whole different conversation about anti-blackness within Asian communities, but who feel that we should get rid of political blackness
Yeah,
because Asian people, the feeling is that some Asian people are prejudiced towards Black people, and even there's a whole conversation about Asian people who've come from East Africa, and
yeah,
then that whole conversation about if somebody from East Africa is prejudiced towards you, how much of that is linked to what was going on in East Africa.
mm.
But I feel like I've just gone off a tangent, but I just think it's an
No,
interesting conversation about
it is
solidarity and change.
definitely. Yeah, of course, of course. And then just to throw an extra spanner in that works, you've got the Caribbean that in some countries like Trinidad, Jamaica, you have quite large populations of Indian people and Chinese people that
Like
have
Guyana in particular, right?
yeah, yes, that was it. Guyana, Trinidad, and yeah, Jamaica. I think Guyana's the biggest numbers in that order because of indentured labor after slavery, and the same with Chinese people as well. We've seen that there is a lot of anti-black sentiment in Asian communities. How then we look at the Caribbean as this, I hate the term melting pot, but it does fit very well as kind of a melting pot of all these different types of people. And then even looking at that list of some of the British Black Panthers, who would be maybe Indo-Caribbean as
Yeah,
opposed to Afro-Caribbean, and how they fit, walking down the street at that time, say, for example, let's say Black men, Black women would be subject to police brutality, sus laws. If you were Indo-Caribbean or Afro-Caribbean, I don't think the police would matter. You would still probably get stopped and searched. You would still be treated ill, because of the way you look. And I don't like to kind of boil blackness down to the way you look or how much melanin you have, or it's weird to kind of relate it to how you might negatively be perceived by someone like the police at that time, as opposed to
yeah.
some other kind of factor. But yeah, it's a big complicated kind of situation, I'd say, when we're thinking about
Even
race.
even the thought you've just introduced, I think is interesting because I think it goes back to even the debates between Marcus Garvey and W. E. Du Bois. Is that how do we
Mm,
want to define blackness?
yeah,
Do we define blackness as a joint struggle, or
yeah,
do we define blackness as, I don't know, something else more positive?
yeah,
Um,
absolutely. Yeah, is
yeah,
our blackness going to just be rooted in struggle? Because that is quite negative. It's a conversation I've had a few times, and I don't get closer to reaching a conclusion in my mind at all.
yeah. I guess maybe that is a way of looking at struggle in a positive way, alternatively, in that we have found
Yeah,
community in that struggle.
true.
Would we feel affinity to Black people who are not from the exact same country that we are if we didn't have
Yeah,
this sense of a joint struggle,
true.
if you get what I mean?
Exactly. Yeah. no, I do definitely. It has unified us in ways we would not have otherwise probably been. Um, Interesting. Right. Let's move on slightly. Only a year later to Olive Morris, 1969.
Prepared for this segment, I've got a paragraph of when the incident was discussed in the House of Commons, which is
Wow.
interesting. And it's interesting that the language that they used to describe this Nigerian diplomat is interesting. So, Olive Morris was born in Jamaica in 1953, and she came over to the UK at the age of 8. So around the same time of what you were talking about earlier with news of the new Commonwealth Immigrants Act. Many people in the UK and many people just in the Caribbean decided to come to the UK during that time so they wouldn't fall foul of the new act. And she grows up in the UK. She's a very outspoken young woman, and one day in 1969, she sees a Nigerian diplomat, a man called Clement Gomwalk, being beaten by the police, or this was her perception that he was being beaten by the police, who had thought that he had stolen his car, which was a Mercedes Benz. There are different conversations about what precisely happened. So whether Olive Morris like intervened whilst the police were beating Clements Gomwalk, or whether she got there later on when Clement wasn't there. But what is known is that she was fined £10, she was stripped and beaten by police, and allegedly threatened with rape after her arrest, and she was given a suspended jail sentence. And so perhaps we could talk about like many of the things going on there. But what I thought was interesting was because Clements Gomwalk was a Nigerian diplomat, this was big news, right? Because how can you be assaulting a Nigerian diplomat?
Mm.
And so this was discussed in the House of Commons. And the then Home Secretary, who later became the Prime Minister, a Labour Prime Minister, so the then Home Secretary said that police inquiries took place on the morning of the 15th of November about a car which was causing a serious obstruction in a waiting area in Brixton. The license plate bore a different number from the road fund license disc, and there was a possibility that the vehicle might have been stolen. Mr. Gomwalk, who was not at this stage known to be a diplomat, returned the car and refused to give any explanation of the ownership. During questioning by the police, a hostile crowd gathered, a struggle took place, and in order to prevent a breach of the peace, Mr. Gomwalk was arrested and then taken to Brixton Police Station. His identity and entitlement to diplomatic immunity were established while he was there, and he was released. In the meantime, a disturbance developed as a result of which 6 other persons were arrested. So
Wow.
a lot going on
Yeah.
there. I think it's
No,
interesting
definitely.
how I think it's interesting how the Home Secretary says a hostile crowd gathered, as though that there was like sort of no reason for them to be hostile.
Yeah.
And a struggle took place. What is the struggle? Olive Morris describes somebody being beaten up, but the
Yeah.
Home Secretary is describing it as a struggle, which is
Yeah.
interesting.
It is. The use of language is there very interesting. But I just it's interesting that it's like, and not to oversimplify this, young woman from Jamaica seeing or not seeing, as the reports have suggested, this diplomat from Nigeria, having a problem, potentially a struggle, being beaten, and she steps in or doesn't step in, but is part of that, and it does link then the situation and well institutional racism within the police because she would not have been treated like that if she was not a black woman, and the diplomat would not have been treated like that if he had not been a black man, and how I think in a way we're kind of again linking this solidarity at a point of struggle, at a point of tension with the police,
And
in Brixton in 1969.
I remember that Olive was only 5'2" as well, and according to reports, she was either 16 or 17 at the time of the incident. Whatever the age, whether she was 16 or 17, that's very, very young to be stepping in a confrontation with police, people who have
Yeah,
like batons and stuff.
definitely. And my apologies for calling her a young woman. She is a girl. She's a young girl at 16. So yeah, it is very interesting, especially because I think we have to talk about this at some point, because she's Jamaican and he's Nigerian, and the tensions seem to be most tense between Jamaicans and Nigerians at different points in our social history of this country, and otherwise. And I think it being Jamaicans tending to be the biggest and probably most well-known Caribbean country, and I think
in the UK.
Nigerians in Britain, yeah, being so large in numbers in terms of migration here. So them being again a loud voice representing Africa. And so, yeah, you've got these two very strong and dominant countries with a lot of national pride and global influence at this kind of point in 1969, where we have young girl Olive Morris kind of jumping in at the defense of a Nigerian diplomat, which is when you kind of lay out all like that, and what happens next with her kind of being harassed and, you know, verbally abused and stripped and threatened, is quite horrifying in more ways than one, I'd say.
It really is, and I think just the fact that she was so young doing so is like is a testament to her character, and also perhaps indicates why people still talk about her today. Unfortunately, she died very, very young of cancer in her late 20s. But you know, there's been a Google Doodle about her and all the books about Black British women's history she's mentioned, due to her tireless activism on the behalf of Black people everywhere, which I think is important. And even the conversation about people from Jamaica versus people from Nigeria and the different, I guess, hostilities we have had. I think it's interesting to note that at Jamaicans and at Jamaica's Independence Day celebrations, there were people from Nigeria there, like Nigerian diplomats of a different form, there to celebrate with them. And if I'm not mistaken, there's even a place in Jamaica called Abeokuta after the place in Nigeria. And we've seen, as we've seen in your podcast and other places that you could get this history, that you know, we've had organizations in Britain which have had West African and West Indian solidarity. So Jamaicans and Nigerians involved, like the legal colored people back in the
Yeah,
day. So
yeah, of
I
course.
think it is important to recognize that whilst we may have these hostilities sometimes,
Mm,
um, we do get together when the going
definitely.
gets rough, I guess, because
Yeah, absolutely.
yes, it's the whole thing of, at the end of the day, if you're going to be impacted by white supremacy, if you're going to be impacted by if you're going to be assaulted by a racist person, they're not going
Hmm.
to ask for your nationality card.
No,
Um,
absolutely. Definitely. I really like as well, just to pull out the point you made about, you know, being present at each other's Independence Day celebrations. And that isn't a moment of struggle, that's a moment of celebration and of
yeah,
pride. And kind of looking outside of the context of Britain, the kind of solidarity that Nigeria and Jamaica, just to take those two countries, have. They've got 50 years, I think, of diplomatic relations. They celebrated last year. They have ambassadors to each other's countries, and there is now, I think, a flight you can get directly from Nigeria to Jamaica, which is the first of its kind. There aren't many flights that go from Africa into the Caribbean directly without having to stop over in Europe or America first. And so, you know,
absolutely.
maybe whilst we're here grumbling and arguing on Twitter about different, you know, silly things in regards to Caribbean and African culture, you know, our home countries are actually making strides to have better diplomatic relations. Yeah, the solidarity. And I did have a look, and I just looked at Jamaica because I didn't have time to do it for all Caribbean countries. But I'm just going to read you a quick list of all the countries you can go to as a Jamaican citizen, visa free in Africa: Niger, Ghana, Gambia, Namibia, Botswana, Uganda, South Africa, Zambia, Lesotho, Tanzania, Kenya, Malawi, Nigeria. I don't believe you don't need a visa, sorry, for any of those countries from just Jamaica. And I think that Caribbean passports tend to kind of carry the same weight. So the fact that these countries, without us here in the diaspora, are linking up and at a point of celebration, not at a point of struggle necessarily, to create links, diplomatic links, trade links, is wonderful to see, I think. And I'm sure Walter Rodney, whose book I have here, and we haven't yet mentioned. I've mentioned him so many times, we haven't even spoken about him, or we might not actually have time to. Is maybe would be proud of.
Marcus Garvey would be proud of us.
Yes.
At several different points in time, what Black people were arguing for sounded ludicrous to many people in power, right? This idea
Mm,
that segregation would end, this idea that empire would end, this idea that slavery would end. All of these things sounded silly to many people in power, but yet they happened. And so I think we need to remind ourselves of that. That's not to say that all ideas that Black people ever come up with are incredible ideas that should never be criticized. But I
Mm,
think it's important to recognize that the good ideas do stand the test of time. And despite
definitely.
rhetoric from politicians, at the end of the day, things will happen if they're meant to
Yeah,
happen.
exactly, definitely. And I just like that note of hope, I think, that, what we once saw as impossible was possible. And I think that might be a beautiful note for us to end on because we've spoken for so long, and I think we've dropped so many gems, loosely centered around the historical context, of different points of Afro-Caribbean solidarity. And I think we could go on for days. There were things on our list that we didn't get around to talking to
In
listeners.
fact,
So
just link to one thing on our list that I
yeah,
think is
no,
important to
go
mention
ahead.
is because we were talking about Jamaican and Nigerian solidarity, as in the countries, not necessarily us as the diaspora
Mm,
kids in the UK. But I think we can really, really see that with the boycott of the 1986 Commonwealth Games in Edinburgh, where all the Black countries and some, well, I think all the Black countries, maybe
mm.
most. I know that there was an issue with Bermuda where they didn't take part in the boycott at first, but then they later
Yeah,
withdrew. But I think, let's say, the vast majority of the Black Commonwealth countries and a couple of Asian Commonwealth countries
yeah,
pulled out of those Commonwealth Games in support of a boycott against apartheid South Africa because they felt like
yeah,
Margaret Thatcher's government wasn't doing enough to send a message to South Africa that apartheid was wrong. And so I think it is important to recognize again that solidarity between our communities and many other communities has lasted for a very, very long time.
yeah.
And it probably will, hopefully, going forward.
Definitely. And there's power in that because who were to say that all these, small islands, and countries in the landmass of Africa could step out of world games that their athletes would have needed to progress in their careers and whatnot, to make a stand against Margaret Thatcher's government, which is, head of empire in 1986. I know most countries would have been independent by then, but still for them to kind of step out on a limb and do that for South Africa, their brothers and sisters there, is, yeah, it is the vision, isn't it, of what we want, of Black solidarity.
I think we really do need to remember that.
And I think on that note, we shall say goodbye. So, Cheyenne, tell me, where should the people find you? I'm going to assume on Twitter somewhere because the Twitter discourse is popping. Yeah, let
I
us
feel
know where
like
to find you. Anything you're working on projects wise, podcasts, what writing. Let us know.
I need to stop getting my news from Twitter, but my Twitter profile is at Sean Speaks. That's at SeunSpeaks. Sean Speaks. I also have a podcast called the Hello from Britain podcast, a Black British history podcast, because I think it's important to learn more about Black British women. Even we were talking today, I think you mentioned, I think David Uda, right? You found it
Yeah,
difficult to find out more about him. And I think just generally I think there's a limited amount of information out there about Black British women in particular. So hopefully through that
definitely.
podcast, people will find some resources to go and
Mm,
look at.
yeah.
Aside
And
from
it's a
that,
fantastic
I
podcast, by the
oh
way,
thank you,
guys. So if you
uh,
haven't already listened, head over there ASAP.
thank you very much. And aside from that, I write regularly in Galdem, so look out for me in Galdem. I guess if you enjoy their website, which is a great website. So yeah, that's me.
Thank you so much. Honestly, it's been a pleasure to have you and talk about all things solidarity, blackness, race, Twitter. The video game analogy is one I'll never forget. It might feature in a future essay from me. But it is true, these movements and these moments are continuing cyclically and in patterns and repetitions. And so be
And we have
interesting.
to.
Maybe we should come back and have this conversation in like 5 years' time and see if anything's changed, or 10, maybe.
Yeah, we have to
Speculating.
remember these solidarity moments, like beyond when Black Panther comes on TV, or
Right.
beyond when something terrible happens. As we said, like
Mhm.
our identity is not rooted in oppression, but can also be rooted in celebration. And so I think it's
Definitely.
important that we recognize this solidarity at all times,
Yeah, I
not
agree.
just yeah.
Definitely. Thank you so much for coming onto the episode. And to all the listeners, please do follow us on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, on Spotify, on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, whichever one you use to listen to podcasts. And I hope you've enjoyed the episode and have a wonderful week. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.
Bye.